build HTML5 games using Impact.js. He's just got tons of sample code online. He's got a book. He is quite good, and he has a bunch of games in the store right now. His favorite is he likes that old 8-bit look and feel to the artwork. So he creates a lot of his own artwork and builds these games using HTML5 and JavaScript, and he gets them running in the browser, and then he gets them running on Windows, and now he's porting them to the phone. So just to close out, so I'm right at time, I want to make sure you know about Dreamspark. Now, if you go to dreamspark.com, you could register there, but it sounds like what you should do is find out the URL for the Harvard Dreamspark site. And if you go in there, you can get Windows, you can get Visual Studio, you can get SQL Server, you can get, everything but an Xbox. All right, you can get basically all of our stuff there. So download the development tools, download the SDKs. You also get a free Windows 8 and a free Windows Phone developer account. That's a $150 value. All right, so students get accounts for free. I want to make sure you guys get access to that. App Builder is our site for developers. If you go there and register, build.windowsstore.com, you can earn points. You can register your apps. They'll send you on some quests, and you'll earn points to be able to win stuff. There's also a ton of training material up there if you're looking for either apps or games. Some other training I found that might be really applicable to what you're doing now is there is a C# Fundamentals online course, set of videos, and then there's also Windows Phone 8 for beginners. So if you're just getting into this space, you just want, hey, I just need to learn some C# and I need to just get started with Windows Phone, those two resources are fantastic. And then the work I was showing you is a project that my team did called API Mash, which is at aka.ms/API Mash, and that will take you to GitHub. So we post all of our stuff up on GitHub. So we've got a bunch of starter kits up there. You scroll down, we have starter kits for Windows and for Windows Phone, and we're actually expanding this list. So everything you see here is being ported over to phone. But we've got Active Access, a Chuck Norris starter kit, Earthquakes and Bing Maps, Edmunds, Facebook, Foursquare, Instagram, Meetup, Messier Sky Objects, Rotten Tomatoes, Stack Exchange, Tumblr, Twitter, Univision, Wikipedia, World of Warcraft, Yelp, and ESPN. So all of these are all functional Windows 8 apps with the code, and everything I showed you, that's the pattern they're all using, that whole Open Data API, call, deserialize, bind to the UI. If you're interested in seeing how you get started building for Windows 8 and for Windows Phone, these are fantastic resources here, all built by my team. So it's all free. It's up on GitHub. The way to do it, you just go to that site and click the download zip file. So we also include a lab workbook. There's 3 lab workbooks in there to just kind of take you through how to get started with this stuff. All right? So wanted to make sure you were aware of that. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bob. We've been posted at cs76.net instructions for how you can get access to a Dreamspark account. So after tonight, you can get that, and then we'll post the slides later tonight.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Why don't we go ahead and take a few-minute break here while Dan gets set up, and then we'll transition to the third and final platform for the evening, Android. All right, we are back. So the third act here is Dan Armendariz, who actually started this class several years ago. So the origins of S76 can be traced back to him and a colleague of his, and it was I who came along a year or so after that I finally got involved. So everything you've seen thus far is all traced back to Dan. So Dan's going to take a look at Android development with us, and without further ado, Dan Armendariz.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be back, so to speak, even though in the context, from where you're sitting, it doesn't really seem that way. The class was very different back then, just like mobile development has really evolved over the years. In fact, in the past year, since the last time that I actually co-taught this class with David, Android development has gotten a lot better, at least in the initial setup. And so we're going to talk about, as quickly as we can, we're going to try to shoehorn what I used to put 4 weeks worth of content into 1 hour. So please allow me some leeway as I go a little quickly through some things. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt at any time, and hopefully we'll be able to get you guys comfortable in such a way that you'll be able to do some Android development as soon as you go home. So just so that I can sort of get a sense of where everybody is, how many of you use an iOS device as your, say, primary phone, an iPhone? That's just about everybody. Now, are there any of you that use an Android device as your primary phone? Okay. So for those of you that have your hands up, is that constant? Do you always use that device rather than an iOS device? All right, so for those of you that had your hands up, you probably are familiar with the differences between the experience of an Android device and an iOS device. And this is actually really important, is that in order to develop on one of these platforms, it really is useful to have a sense of what that platform is actually like to be able to use it. And so if you are serious about actually doing cross-platform work, just to reiterate comments that Bob made in the first hour, it's really helpful to get a sense of that experience and how you will actually want to replicate that on this other device. And even though Android is considered to be the primary competitor to iOS, it's really difficult to put them, I think, on that same sort of comparison. They operate in very different ways. They have very different reasonings behind very different decisions that went into their implementation. And there's a lot of maybe, let's see, what is the proper word to use here? There's perhaps a lot of difference between the two and a lot of confusion between the two that really just arise from these sort of basic differences, that arose initially from when Google first started developing Android and when Apple first started developing iPhone and iOS. So this is actually pretty important for us as well as developers. So for us as developers, what are some of the differences that we typically hear about about developing for iOS versus developing for Android? So if you were to go onto a tech blog and read the comments that people always post whenever Apple or whenever Google updates one of their hardware devices, people always complain about the same sorts of things, right? What are these differences? What do Android users dislike about iPhones, and what do iPhone users dislike about Android? Any ideas? Yeah.
Android users dislike how, as a developer, you have much limited perspective on iOS rather than Android. You have more functionality that you can deal with.
So perhaps if I could summarize that in a way to say that people consider Android to be a little bit more open than iOS. And so that is certainly true in many respects, even for us as developers. When you create a developer account with Google, you pay a one-time $25 fee. You have an account with them. Basically, that $25 fee is to weed out people that just want to flood the store with spam. It's not a terribly high fee, but it is one fee that you have to do. But then after that, you are free to submit your applications to the store. There's no review process. And you basically create your application, you publish it to the store, and then that's it. It's up and ready for people to download. That's just one sense that Google might be a little bit more open than Apple. But there's other ways as well. You have a little bit more control over your phone, some people would argue, a little bit more customization. Whereas in iOS, they try to really funnel you towards a certain type of experience, which in itself, I'm framing it not in the sense that this is a negative, but in fact that it's a very different way of thinking about this. Google allows you to have a lot more options, and so it can, to people who are not familiar with the system, appear to be a little bit more complex. And so again, this is just that same sort of idea that we want to point out, the differences between the two. Did you have a question or a difference?
The APIs, are they open source on Android?
So for the longest time, Android was open source, but they have, in fact, closed sourced some of them. So a lot of the code is, in fact, open source, but I think some of the now more basic functions are, in fact, closed source from Google. But yeah, that was also a primary difference between Apple and Android. Again, we could perhaps include this within this openness aspect. What about other things? Anything else as developers that might be different? Yes?
iOS developers might say that Android's more fragmented.
Right, so this is definitely a big one that we hear a lot, is that this fragmentation in Android devices. And in fact, this is a very important point that I want to bring up right away, is that there is some truth to this in what is actually fragmented. There are many different types of hardware devices available with the Google operating system, with the Android operating system, from different manufacturers, whereas Apple is the only manufacturer of iPhone and iPad. There are many different manufacturers that use Android as a platform. And even within that context, many people don't update their software as much as we as developers might want them to. And there's a variety of reasons for this. Some of them may not be aware that there's an update. Some of them, but I think one of the more pressing problems is that with many of the third-party phones that come out that have Android on them, they add a lot of stuff to it. Sort of like when you buy a PC and it has a lot of stuff installed. And my friend just bought an Asus, and he said that it had like a, oh my gosh, I wish I could remember exactly what it was, but it was like an Asus internet connection help wizard or some sort of very specific thing that he was kind of surprised that they actually bothered. This one hardware company actually bothered to create the software for it. And it's sort of a similar thing. A lot of these companies will, in fact, add their own additional UI components on top of the Android base OS, which further adds to perhaps some of the confusion between different users. When you pick up an Android device from, say, Samsung versus one that Google created with just the base Android OS, it might actually look different, even though it has the same version of the OS, because of these additional little flares and additional pieces of software that they will actually add on to this. Now, I don't want to confuse the issue. All of that stuff aside, one of the base issues in this fragmentation argument is just the wide range of versions that are installed on hardware devices right now. So this is a chart that Google actually created. They release a similar chart every half month or every month or so, showing the distribution of devices that connect to the Google Play Store, which is the equivalent of the App Store on iOS. And as we can see here, there's really no one slice of this pie that makes up the majority of the devices. It really runs the gamut from Gingerbread right here, which is a version 2 of Android OS, which is now several years old, all the way up to Jelly Bean, which is one of the later versions, version 4.1 and 4.2. And now there's an even newer version, 4.3, but I'm not sure that any devices have been released that actually have that, or that it's actually been released at this point. Now, sort of the saving grace here with this is that if you did want to target a lot of these users, you can actually create, of course, an application that is targeted at one of these APIs, one of these earlier APIs, and be able to get a large portion of the market. And by the market, I mean the available market for your application. Of course, if you wanted to use some API that's only available in some later version of the OS, then you will perhaps limit yourself in terms of the market that is available for that. But the Android OS isn't the only reason why this system might be considered fragmented. We also have things such as the screen size and the density. Like I said, the actual hardware devices are very, very different. And this is just, I intentionally left out some of the explanation of some of these, but just to show you that this is really all over the place, with screen size on the left and screen density on the right. And Google goes through and on the website differentiating all of these in terms of the exact pixel dimensions and the exact number of dots per inch in each of the densities here. But really, we can see that we have a problem. And that is that if you want to create an application for an Android device that should work on a multitude of devices, you do have to contend with this issue that there are many different types of devices running many different types of OSs that have very different hardware capabilities. Now, to Google's credit, they have done everything that they can to try to combat this issue. They really try hard to make it possible for you to create an application that can run on a lot of these sorts of devices. And in fact, one of the ways that they are able to do this is through this inclusion of resources within an application. So there is, and we're going to get a little bit technical at this moment before we kind of come back a little bit wider and talk about what exactly, how exactly this works. Oh, and it looks like a font is missing here. So So basically, application resources are stored in a resource folder. It just says RES. And there's a variety of different folders. It's a hierarchy of folders. And within that, there's a variety of other directories that you